and welcome to Geek Speak with Envision IT, a podcast for business leaders and technology experts that like to stay on top of the latest security news and listen to interviews with insightful industry leaders. I'm Bill Crane, Chief Stakeholder Architect and CTO at Envision IT. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode. Today, we're going to talk about FSLogix, and we previously talked about that on a webinar, and this is a follow-up from that. It's been quite a long time since then, and through the process of working with FSLogix, we've learned a lot more and ran into some things that we thought would be good to give you some tips and tricks. And with me today is Scott Bussey. Hello, Scott.
Hey, good morning.
And Todd Borchert. Hello, Todd.
Hey there. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So, Scott and Todd, you guys happen to work with FSLogix quite a bit. So what are some of the items we've run into?
So I think some of the things we're looking at now are some of more of the advanced features, such as cloud cache and replicating it to a DR location. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with what cloud cache is, essentially what it is you configure two SMB shares to write to the same, or to write to two different locations, and it writes to both of those at the same time, but it'll only read from one. And the idea behind it is if you had to reboot a file server, or if you have to flip over to a DR location, that it would you would not have to do any updates for either the profile container or the ODFC container. So we've had numerous clients set this up and testing it out. And at this point, we're recommending that we do not implement any cloud cache. We've seen various errors with the FSLogix service hanging, and a few other odds and odd errors that we can't quite explain. So we've actually pulled cloud cache out of those locations, and everything is returning to normal. So at this point in time, though, there is a public preview for the next version of FSLogix from Microsoft. Not really sure when that's going to be released, but it will address some of these issues. So I think at that point in time, we'll revisit the cloud cache implementation and see how it works after that.
So it's a good concept, but not quite ready for prime.
Not quite ready for prime time yet. So what we're doing is, in the meantime, if we have to get profile container or ODFC container to a destination location, we're just using really the robocopy with the copy all switch.
Got it.
And hopefully in this next release, so with that public preview, they did list a number of changes/fixes for the release. And there's probably about 4 or 5 things for cloud cache itself. A number of them are around performance-related issues. So hopefully this next release will take care of the majority of these items, and then we can start giving it a better look.
What's the next item on the list?
So the next item on the list is really how we do set up the profile container as well as the ODFC. And the ODFC, we call it that because that's what FSLogix call it, but it's really the O365 container. So when we do set up an implementation, we split those two pieces out. So we will have a profile container separated out from the Office 365 container piece. And the reason we do that is twofold. So one, by splitting it out, the ODFC is essentially really just caching items. So when we talked about the cloud cache and setting those pieces out, we would not replicate the ODFC piece in the event of a DR. We would just let it recreate the cache at the DR site. So that's one reason we break it out. Another reason is flexibility. So if you wanted the profile container stored in one place and the cloud cache stored in another place, you have that flexibility. Also, with the sizes of some of these too, some clients want to save, let's say, a year or so of Outlook cache. Well, that fills up pretty quickly. So by default, these containers are 30 gig each in size, and by splitting it out, we alleviate some issues if they run into that size limit by affecting both the profile container and the ODFC. So in general, it's a good practice to break it out. It gives you flexibility in the future.
I think the other nice things about splitting them out is if you're looking at items that may bloat the profile, where obviously it's kind of less of a problem when you go down the FSLogix route, but when you're looking through those profile containers, if you don't have like that OneDrive cache or that Outlook cache in there, it's a little bit easier to zero in on some of those directories or files that are really starting to grow and get big. So I kind of add that as a third reason for splitting out.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and as long as we're talking about the Outlook piece too, there's a couple of things not to do. So one thing that can cause weird indexing issues with the Outlook is the shared mailboxes. So if you have shared mailboxes added to the main mailbox, you want to enable a policy that always puts the shared mailbox in inline mode. You do not want to cache a shared mailbox. And this also this is the same thing if you're going to be doing the UPM version of the caching as well. What happens is it will bloat that index and it'll keep re-indexing on every login, which defeats the purpose of what we're trying to do. So if you go out to FSLogix site, they really have some great Outlook troubleshooting tips out there. And this is, I think, the number one item is do not cache shared mailboxes.
All right. Any other Outlook items?
Yeah, so the other Outlook item is when you are installing Outlook on your image, make sure that you have the Windows Search Service running. Because if you don't, there are certain DLLs, etc., that Outlook needs and aren't installed if that search service is not running. So make sure you do that. And if you're unsure if you had it running or not when you do this, you can just run a full online repair with the search service running, and that'll install what it needs.
Got it. And I know too, just to wrap up the Outlook items, you had some items around Ost corruption as well.
Yeah, we've seen some issues with a couple of our clients where a user will go through the log off process, but there'll be an application or some service that'll hold the session open, and it'll actually lock that VHD file. And then when they come in, if they're not doing like nightly reboots, or so if they come in the next day and try to log in, or if they try to log in a little bit later in the day and try to open Outlook, they'll get errors saying that the OST file is in use, and then they're unable to use the program. So what happens is there's multiple connections to that VHD file, and the second session has it set read-only mode, so they can't write to the file, unfortunately. And the only way we've seen to get around, or the only way we've been able to fix that, is by closing all the sessions and removing the OST file. So what we've been trying to do is find those programs that hold the session open. And Citrix provides a registry key that will kind of auto-close them after, forget what the value is, it's like 10 seconds after the log off if it's still open. So that has alleviated a lot of those problems, but just kind of something to watch out for. And that's the case really with anything session related that might hold the session open. It's something you want to keep an eye on.
Got it.
Yeah, because when you're doing profile container, you run into that same issue. If the session is open and they try to log in again, depending on how you have that configured, it will most likely do a read-only for that profile because the read-write's already in use by the session that's currently open.
And I think the other thing we've seen from time to time is where it'll do like a temporary profile, so they'll lose all their settings temporarily until we can get them back to their normal profile. So it's kind of another thing that we've seen.
Yeah, and if you don't want them logging in with that temporary profile too in the FSLogix templates, you can configure that to not allow that situation to happen. It just depends on how many service calls you want to generate and what times, if you want to enable that or not.
Yeah, I guess the option there is to let them work with a temporary or not work at all, right?
Yeah, that's kind of what we're defaulting to, is just to get them in at least at some point.
Right. Okay. How about, I know, certainly FSLogix and other products are the way too, but, there's some art to redirection and in what you include and exclude.
Yeah, so with the profile container, there's a redirections file that we definitely recommend using. And we have a lot of things in there, such as, caching for Firefox is a big one, caching for Chrome. We get rid of some of those items in there. And then there's also, I think, some exclusions for the new Edge, too, so you may want to look those up. But it really comes down to managing your profile in your environment like you would do with similar to UPM, inspecting what the profiles are from time to time, figuring out what that bloat is, and then excluding it in that redirections file.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea there is to kind of tune for performance and kind of the growth of the container.
Correct, yeah, because then what happens is when you get rid of the items in there, and what we'll do to clean things out is we'll use like a group policy preference item to delete certain folders upon login, but that still leaves that container that size with white space in it.
Got it.
So if you look around, there are tools that you can use to resize those VHDX files. And that's all part of managing that profile container as well as the ODFC container.
Okay.
And the other point to that too is if you're splitting out your profile in your ODFC container like we're recommending, you need to put exclusions in for basically all the things that get stored in that ODFC container. So in the FSLogix documentation, there's a section under the Office container about third-party exclusions. And lay out there real well all the exclusions for like OneDrive, Outlook, Skype for Business, licensing portion if you're using Office 365 Pro Plus. So you want to pay attention to that stuff as well.
Okay, makes sense. How about other exclusions?
So I think there's some AV exclusions. I'll let Todd talk more about those.
Yeah, from an AV standpoint, there's multiple places that you need to configure the exclusions. So on the file server that hosts the VHD files or the VHDX files, you want to definitely do a path exclusion for that share. The other thing we came across recently is for a particular client is even though we had the path exclusion in place, it was still scanning the .lock files, which get put in place when those when they have the container open. So that lock file tells it whether to use the read write or the read only container. So we ended up having to do file type exclusions for .lock and then .vhdx too. For some reason, it wasn't honoring the path exclusion, and it was still scanning those lock files, which was causing the stuff we talked about earlier, like the temporary profile and the read-only container. And then on the VHD side, if you're using Cloud Cache, you want to exclude that Cloud Cache process, as well as the program data, FSLogix, and then there's a cache location where it actually downloads the VHD and stores a temporary copy of it. And then for the actual FSLogix process itself, and I forget what that's called offhand, but you want to exclude that process from your AV as well. And then if you're not using the Cloud Cache, it actually stores those VHD files in the VHDX files in the C Windows temp folder. So you want to do an exclusion there as well. Unfortunately, that stuff's not really well documented in their documentation. It's kind of trial and error at this point. So we're still kind of putting together a list that has worked well for our clients.
Got it. Yeah, I guess the idea is that, don't spend time and resources scanning things that don't matter, right? Like, or worse yet, maybe it'll cause issues by locking files or something like that.
Yeah, and many Citrix admins are probably familiar with the process monitor utility is a great tool to help kind of track down what could potentially be locking the VHDX files or those log files. It's not always antivirus, but that's probably the most common thing that we see.
Got it. Okay. Well, any other items you guys have?
So I think when we're talking about configuration, it's always really good to go out to FSLogix site and read through the forums, as well as just some of the setup guides they have in there. There's definitely some configuration, what to do, what not to do. So one of the topics we've been seeing for the past 6 months or so is with the Windows 2019 and some of the issues people are seeing with the search roaming there. And at this time, the recommendation for 2019 is to disable search roaming altogether, because Server 2019 actually has built-in per-user search roaming itself. So that's one of those items. It's like, stay tuned. So if you did have that enabled, you're probably seeing issues. And that was one of the issues we were actually seeing in our environment too. So just following those recommendations fix those issues.
Great. Yeah, I just kind of echo that statement. There's a section in the documentation from Microsoft called the reference section. And I think it's really good to read through that, because there's the settings will change depending on what OS you're using. So like Windows 10, like a normal Windows 10 install versus that new Windows 10 multi-session or virtual desktop edition. And then also like Server 2016 versus Server 2019. Depending on what OS you're using, there's different settings. So most of that stuff is called out really well, and typically it's in bold, so it kind of stands out. So it's just good to read through all that and just pay really good attention to all the different settings.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, some of the other configuration changes we do when we're setting up too is log files. So since by default the log files are stored on the non-persistent disk, when things are rebooted, you lose all those log files. So we recommend sending them out to a persistent disk, assuming you are doing some sort of write cache with either the MCS or the PVS. So we'll configure those to redirect to that location and then retain about 7 days. So it has its own cleanup after that 7 days, so there isn't, log files consuming all that disk space out there. That really helps for troubleshooting after reboots.
Yeah, I guess the log files don't do you a lot of good if they're erased.
They're not there, right?
Right.
We never want to say, "Hey, sorry, you restarted."
Right.
There's a lot of log files as well. There's probably about 12 or 15 different log files. One of the things that I like to do is it also creates the application and services section in the event log. There's an FSLogix section. So I usually like to look there first, because that'll kind of help you identify which log you need to go and look at closer.
Okay.
And then those log files have a lot more detailed information, but it can just be kind of overwhelming trying to figure out which one you need to look at. So
yeah, it makes a lot of sense. All right. Any other items? I think the last thing I see is some Upm exclusions.
Yeah, I think that just kind of goes back to the point earlier about so for things like OneDrive, the FSLogix ODFC container is the only supported way to do OneDrive. So if you're not in scenarios where you're using maybe FSLogix for that piece, but you're still using like Citrix Profile Management or some other profile management solution for I guess you'd call them the profile settings, you have to go back and look at that exclusion section. So the things we kind of talked about earlier, the OneDrive folders, the Outlook folders, all that stuff needs to be excluded in your other profile management solution in order for the ODFC container to work properly.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you guys. I don't know if there's any other items you had, but thanks for the time today. I mean, I guess as we use this more and more, as new OSs come out and new antivirus comes out, we're always learning. So it's nice that we're able to share that information.
All right. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. If you have any questions or you have future topics you'd like us to cover, please connect with us via the link in the show notes. And if you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to like and subscribe. We'll see you next time on Geek Speak with Envision IT.